who's actually going to get the most out of a compact workstation, and who's better off walking away? Is a mini PC like the HP Z2G9 worth the price tag for a typical office user, or does it only make sense for a niche group of creators and engineers? Those are the questions that keep me up at night before I click Add to Cart. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When you start looking at mini PCs, the first thing that trips most people up is the trade-off between size and expandability. The Z2G9 packs a 14th Gen i7-14700K, 32 GB of RAM and a 1 TB SSD into a chassis that's about the size of a thick paperback. That footprint is a godsend if your desk is already crowded with monitors, drawing tablets, and a stack of reference books, but it also means you're limited to the ports that fit on the front and rear panels. In practice, you get a decent mix: USB-A, USB-C with power delivery, HDMI 2.1, DisplayPort, Ethernet and a couple of audio jacks. For a single monitor setup or a dual monitor rig using a dock, it's more than enough, but if you need 4 or more external displays you'll have to invest in a USB-C hub or a Thunderbolt dock, which adds cost and another piece of hardware to manage. The real question for most buyers is whether the performance you get justifies the price when you compare it to a mid-range tower or a high-end laptop. The i7-14700K is a 16-core, 24-thread beast that can handle heavy spreadsheet calculations, 3D rendering of moderate complexity, and even some video encoding without breaking a sweat. In my own test, I opened a 30 GB Photoshop file, applied a series of filters, and the Z2G9 stayed under 30°C on the CPU while the fans whispered at about 25 dB. That's impressive for a chassis that small, and it tells you the thermal design isn't just a marketing gimmick. However, the fan does spin up when you push the CPU into sustained turbo for more than a minute, and you'll notice a slight hiss if your office is otherwise quiet. If you're a sound-sensitive podcaster or you work in a library, that might be a deal-breaker. One of the biggest advantages of a mini PC like this is the way it frees up desk real estate. I've seen people replace a bulky tower with the Z2G9 and instantly reclaim a foot of space, which lets you bring a larger monitor or even a second monitor without rearranging the whole workstation. For freelancers who hop between co-working spaces, the small size also means you can pack it in a laptop bag and set up a full desktop environment wherever you go. The downside is that internal upgrades are not as straightforward as opening a tower. The SSD is a standard 2.5-inch drive, so swapping it out is easy, but the RAM is soldered onto the motherboard in many configurations. The model I looked at has soldered RAM, which means you're stuck with 32 GB unless HP releases a higher capacity board. If you anticipate needing 64 GB or more for massive datasets, you'd be better off with a traditional tower that lets you slot in additional DIMMs. From a software perspective, the Z2G9 ships with Windows 11 Pro, which is fine if you need Domain Join and BitLocker, but it also means you're dealing with a full desktop OS rather than a thin client. That's a plus for developers who need to run Docker containers, virtual machines, or compile code locally. I ran a couple of Visual Studio builds that normally take 12 minutes on a standard Office PC, and they finished in about 8 minutes on the Z2G9. The speed gain is noticeable, but it's not a magical leap. You'll still feel the limits when you try to compile a massive C++ codebase with hundreds of modules. In that scenario, a full-size workstation with better cooling and the ability to add a second GPU would outpace the mini PC. Speaking of GPUs, the Z2G9 does not include a dedicated graphics card. It relies on the integrated Intel UHD graphics that come with the i7-14700K. For most office tasks, email, spreadsheets, web browsing, that's more than sufficient, and even light photo editing runs smoothly. However, if you're doing serious 3D modeling in Blender or rendering video in Premiere Pro, you'll quickly run into the limits of the integrated solution. The lack of a discrete GPU is the biggest practical weakness for anyone whose workflow leans heavily on GPU acceleration. You can add an external GPU via Thunderbolt, but that defeats the purpose of a compact workstation and adds a significant cost. So who should walk away? If you're a creative professional who relies on GPU-heavy applications, or an IT department that needs to field replace multiple high-performance machines with a single, uniform platform, the Z2 G9 probably won't meet those expectations without additional accessories. Also, if you're a gamer looking for high frame rates at 1440p or above, you'll be disappointed this isn't a gaming rig. On the other hand, if you're a data analyst, a software developer, an architect who works mainly with